Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the launch of our new report on evaluating multi-intervention outreach and mentoring programs and the launch of our planning and evaluation tool, the Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool, or MOAT for short. Before we kick off, just have a few housekeeping points to run through. You're all automatically muted and your videos are off. Any questions you have, please enter them using the Q&A function. I'm not sure that I don't think the chat's working, so please use the Q&A function. Like to let you know that we're recording this session and we'll be circulating the recording after the event. We've enabled closed captioning for those who wish to use it during the event, so to access that, please use the closed captions. Please select the captions icon in the toolbar below, and we'll also be after your feedback. So please do keep an eye out for a post-event survey in your inboxes as soon as the event has finished. So today, as I said, we'll be sharing an overview of our multi-intervention outreach project and the key findings from that work. We'll be hearing from one of our project partners before a presentation on the findings from our mentoring evaluation, and then we'll be introducing you to TESO's Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool before finally hearing from HEAT, and then there'll be time for some questions, some Q&A to our panelists before finally wrapping up. Next slide. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. So I would like to welcome Yassi Qureshi, who we worked with, Senior Evaluation Advisor from King's College London and one of our project partners. Welcome to Hannah Leyland, who is Impact Manager from Brightside and who we work with on the mentoring project, and Anna Anthony from the Higher Education Access Tracker from HEAT, who we've been working with in developing the MOAT. So next slide, please. I will now hand over to my colleague Sarah to take you through the project overview and key project findings.
Thank you very much, Helen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah and I'm a Senior Research Officer at TESO. And like Helen said, I'm just going to go through the project and some of our interim findings at this stage and the reports that we're publishing today. So just a brief introduction to what multi-intervention outreach programs are, which I'm sure most of you will be aware of. But the reason we've focused on them so much is that we know they're a very common approach used in the sector, but they're also very resource intensive because they combine a range of activities such as a summer school or subject tasters or information, advice and guidance over a sustained period of time. So over several years or across a year, but we need to build the evidence on their effectiveness. So currently the evidence on their effectiveness is a bit mixed. So we have correlational evidence. So we know that these programs are associated with positive attitudes and intentions towards HE to higher education. And we have more recent evidence now that participation in these programs is associated with enrollment in higher education, so actually attending higher education. But this evidence doesn't show us that there's a causal link from the program attendance to the outcomes of interest. So that's because most of these programs, students or the school themselves will self-select to go to these programs, and they may already be quite interested in attending higher education. So it means we can't be sure that the program itself is causing the outcomes. So we're lacking this causal evidence, particularly in a UK context. So there is a bit more evidence in the US, but the findings are quite mixed. So we really need to build that causal evidence, which definitively says that these programs are leading to the outcomes that we want. Another important element as well is that a lot of the evidence is focusing on whether these programs work as a whole. So we don't have much evidence or much studies which look to unpick the actual effect of the individual elements which make up these programs. So that's something we wanted to focus on as well. So the actual aims of the project were to build the evidence on these programs, so the multi-intervention outreach programs, but also understand how best to evaluate these programs. So we'll be hearing about the MOAT, the Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool, later on in this session. And that was developed as part of the project to try and support better evaluation in this area. So we had multiple project partners that we want to say a huge thank you to. This project has been going on for over 2 years now, and it's been brilliant to work so closely with different university partners for this. So our first partner is University of Birmingham. They run a multi-intervention outreach program from years 8 to year 11, so over several years for younger students. And what we did as part of this evaluation was, first of all, a comparison of participants who attended the University of Birmingham program to a matched group that didn't attend, and compared their outcomes. But what we also did, which was a bit different, was a randomized control trial to look at how to engage, or whether you can engage parents and guardians in the program, and whether personalized messaging helped to engage them more and increase their attendance at the program. Secondly, we worked with King's College London, or KCL. So you'll be hearing from Yassi later with a bit more insight into this particular local evaluation, but slightly different in that their program is focused on just before higher education, so focusing on year 12 and year 13, so 16 to 18-year-olds. And what we did here was a randomized control trial of their multi-intervention outreach program, the K+ program, which focuses particularly on progression to highly selective universities. And this program is oversubscribed, so it did mean we could do that randomized control trial, which means that students were randomly allocated to either receive a place on the program or not receive a place on the program. And then we could compare their outcomes to see whether participation in the program leads to the outcomes we want. And finally, we worked with Aston University. So they're quite similar to King's in that they're focused on year 12 and year 13 students, but slightly different in that they're focused on pathways to particular careers, so STEM or healthcare. So there was 2 separate programs that we did a randomized controlled trial, so a similar format to that for King's College London. So those were our 3 project partners and our 3 local evaluations that we worked on. But as a project, there was lots of different aspects to it. So in the pink or red, as it may look on your screen, that is the local evaluations that I was just talking about in terms of Aston, Birmingham and King's College London. But as part of the project, we also did a lot of collaborative work across the partners. So to start with, looking at how common and, the commonalities and differences between the programs. So even Aston and King's that are both focusing on the same age group of students, how those programs differ in terms of the activities that made up those programs, but also developing an evaluation tool, so the MOAT, that again I'll talk about later, but also doing an exploratory evaluation of mentoring, which was done across the project partners, which Hannah from Brightside will be talking a little bit more about in a moment. So I really want to get across that there's a few different outputs that have been published today from this report, and I appreciate might not know where to look because there's so many separate reports coming out. So first of all, we have our main report. So this is really a summary of the local evaluation, so what went on at King's, at Birmingham and at Aston. So it's summarising that methodology and findings, as well as providing a bit of a literature review on what we currently know around multi-intervention outreach programs, providing some key findings from the mentoring evaluation that was done, as well as introducing the MOAT, so our Mapping Outcomes and Activities tool. So it's a main report, it's a summary report that kind of has everything in it. So that's a really good place to start. But we also have our local evaluation reports. So for each of our project partners, it goes into a lot more depth about what exactly was done and what was found, so they're more analysis reports. So these are good to go into as well if you want that more detail and to understand what was done at each of the local providers a bit more. As I've already mentioned, we also decided to focus on mentoring particularly, as mentoring is difficult to evaluate. And it's often quite a chunky part of programs. So we decided to focus on mentoring specifically. So we have a separate publication focused on mentoring. And then finally, we have our mapping outcomes and activities tool, our MOAT. So we've got a separate output for that, which I am going to go into a lot more detail on later on in this webinar. So that's just an overview of the different outputs that we have from this project. But it's also worth flagging that these are interim findings at the moment. So our primary outcome for this project is enrolment in HE, so whether students actually attend higher education. And at the moment, we don't have that data. It doesn't become available until 2024 for students that were in year 12 and year 13 at the start of this project. So these are interim findings at the moment. So what are the key findings? So for Birmingham, as I said, we looked at participation in their programme compared to a matched comparator group. And we did find that participation in their programme was associated with an increased likelihood of enrolling in higher education. So we did some particular analysis for Birmingham for years gone by in terms of participants on their programme. It is worth saying here, though, that due to we were lacking in some of the data, essentially, so we weren't able to have as good a matched comparator group as we wanted in terms of things like prior attainment. So it does mean we can't go beyond a correlation or an association here. So we can't say for definite that the participation in the programme increased the likelihood of enrolling in HE. But in terms of the slightly different randomized controlled trial we did with Birmingham, that was some interesting findings that personalized messaging to parents and guardians did increase engagement with events. So you can find out more about that particular trial through the Birmingham local evaluation reports. Secondly, so for King's College London, as I said, we're just looking at interim findings, so intermediate measures at the moment. So here we looked at whether students self-reported that they had applied to higher education by the UCAS deadline. And here we found that there wasn't a difference between students that had attended the KCL programme, the K+ programme, and those that didn't attend. So we didn't find a difference there. Aston, slightly different. So here we looked at UCAS data. So we had HE application data as well as acceptance rates. And again, here we found that there was no difference between application rates or there was no effect for students that had attended their Pathway to Healthcare and Pathway to STEM programs compared to those that didn't. So it's quite mixed findings here. But again, I am going to flag that these are interim findings. So we need to treat them cautiously until we get that final outcome data. So until we have that enrolment in higher education data, which will be out in 2024. So watch this space. I'm just going to briefly touch on mentoring as well. So as I mentioned, we decided to pull out mentoring in particular because it can be difficult to evaluate or generate evidence on, and that's because it can really differ across programs. So the mode of delivery, whether it's online, whether it's face-to-face, whether it's one-to-one or group sessions, but also the type of mentor. Are they an undergraduate, a graduate, a peer, a professional, a staff member? So it really differs. So we wanted to try and focus on mentoring particularly, and because Aston and King's College London both use Brightside online mentoring, that was a good opportunity to sort of pull the data and have a look what we could see there and ways to evaluate mentoring. So to start with, looking at commonalities and differences. Secondly, measuring engagement. So as I said, Brightside is an online mentoring platform. So how can we measure engagement online? What are the best ways to do that? What data can we use? Understanding the volume and content. So doing some content analysis to see what are mentors and mentees talking about most often. But also, is there a relationship between engagement with mentoring and engagement with that overall multi-intervention outreach program? So some key findings here as well. So I would really recommend going into the mentoring report if you're interested in this, because we're only going to touch on it briefly here. But here we found that engagement is best measured through multiple measures. So quite often you might just look at the number of messages sent and think, okay, that student has sent 10 messages, so they must be quite engaged compared to someone who's only sent one message. But we actually found that someone might send 10 messages, but only on one day out of the whole 18-month program, which doesn't really constitute engagement in that sense. So it's really important to look at the days spent on the platform, the days engaged, as well as the number of messages sent. We did find a positive relationship, as I guess you would expect. So those that did engage with mentoring in terms of the number of days spent on the platform and the number of messages that they sent on the platform, that was positively correlated with their attendance and their engagement in the rest of the program events. Interesting finding was that messages were more likely to be in response to a mentor. So mentees, students were unlikely to reach out themselves. They really needed that their mentor to get in touch first for them to engage. So quite an important finding in terms of how to structure mentoring and how to train mentors. And in terms of the content analysis, again, perhaps to be expected because they were working with year 12 and year 13 students, but the most common message content was around UCAS application, so support with their application and their personal statements, but also around subject choices, which was interesting as well. So I have spoken for long enough, I'm sure now, so I'm going to hand you over to Yassi, and she is going to talk through some insights from participating in the randomised controlled trial at King's College London. So over to you, Yassi.
Thank you, Sarah. Can start. Thanks. We can start with the first slide. Thank you. So I'm Yati. I'm from the What Works team at King's, and I'm going to be talking about the K+ RCT. So the K+ program is an 18-month program that is delivered to sixth form students. It's a MYOM, so it delivers 13 different events that includes mentoring, careers, an academic masterclass, a summer school, and also sort of study skills and a graduation event. The aim of the program is to increase progression to highly selective universities for participants. And the reason that an RCT was conducted is because the program had sort of conducted some evaluation previously, but that was sort of comparative group analysis, which showed mixed results, but there wasn't an RCT or any causal evidence to show whether the program actually had a causal impact on progression to higher education, particularly to that outcome for highly selective universities. We can move to the next slide. So when looking at K+ as a candidate to conduct an RCT, one of the reasons why the program was such a good candidate is, as we've discussed, it's oversubscribed. So there was a really large sample to work with. So the K+ program receives over 1,000 applications, and usually when there isn't an RCT that has been conducted, selection to the program uses a points-based system to rank applicants looking at eligibility criteria that they have, which is a mixture of their sort of meeting WP status demographics and the grades that they have attained. So when conducting an RCT, instead of going through with this points-based system to rank students, the total number of students who met the eligibility criteria was taken, and the random allocation to a control and treatment group was able to be conducted on that level. And the reason that the number of students that participate in your study is important, it matters when you get to the analysis stage, because you need to have a certain number of students in order for your study to have statistical power. And you can run a power calculation which will tell you how many students you would need. And that is very much dependent on what you're trying to measure. So what it is that you're trying to move, or your outcome. And generally speaking, the smaller the effect size of your outcome, the more students you would need to measure. We can move to the next slide. So the actual summary of the evaluation and the methodology itself was conducting a two-armed RCT, so taking that total number of eligible students from the total research sample and allocating them to a control or treatment group. The K+ program does have various different subject streams, so there's 8 total subject streams, and so there were control and treatment groups that were allocated to either of those all of those subject streams. And the program has this 2 levels of outcome. So we have a main long-term outcome, which is increasing progression to highly selective universities, but we also have intermediate outcomes which relate to self-efficacy, sense of belonging, and social capital. And I thought it would be useful to discuss the actual ethics application, so the process of receiving ethical approval to conduct an RCT. So there were 3 key things that I thought would be useful to highlight within the actual application that helped to gain approval. So one of the first things is that obviously, because there is a gap in the literature around the causal evidence of myON programs, there's a need to conduct this type of research in order to fill that gap and find whether there is a causal impact. One of the things that tends to raise ethical concerns when conducting an RCT is that if you conduct an RCT and you limit the number of places on a program because you need to generate a control group, it means that you're withholding a treatment for someone who may benefit from it. Because the program is so oversubscribed, it means that the total number of spaces that would always be available would still be filled and would still have enough additional students that could be used for a control group. And then with regards to consent, the application form had an opt-out, as well as very clearly stating for students how they could withdraw from the process at any stage. We can move to the next slide. In terms of sort of overall reflections, I think one of the first things that is useful to highlight is that a lot of the challenges that came from conducting this study weren't necessarily focused on conducting an RCT itself or the RCT methodology. A lot of those were related to data, particularly with the sort of outcome measures. The intermediate outcome measures that were used were not validated. That was a bit of a challenge. The fact that this was the first study of its kind meant that there were a number of things that maybe weren't necessarily anticipated. The sort of receiving the final outcome was much further along in the process than we would have anticipated, which also created some challenges. But overall, I think it was an incredibly valuable process, and actually identified a lot of things that would need to be done. So for instance, identifying the need for more validated measures. The process of collaborating with other higher education providers was incredibly useful. And also to improve accountability and governance. I think the work that was done to reflect on the theory of change and reflect on what kind of outcomes the program is trying to achieve, and particularly aligning those activities with those outcomes, is something that, by going through that work for this RCT, I think helped to update a lot of the thinking and to sort of challenge a lot of the thinking around what the program is trying to achieve, and how the sort of the various different aspects of the program, because a MYOM is such a complex and sort of large program to deliver, how those all sort of align. I think there was a lot of work that was done with this project that helped the team to improve the kind of robustness of evaluation in general. That's thank you.
Thank you very much, Yassi. That was great. And I can see there are some questions in the chat. But yeah, for any further clarifications or questions on sort of King's part in the project, or any of the methodology queries that Yassi just went through, please do add them and we'll address them at the end. One other point to note as well is that you might hear the acronym MYOM mentioned. So Yassi's mentioned it a couple of times. So just to flag, that stands for Multi-Intervention Outreach and Mentoring. So MYOM, so sometimes used as an acronym, as Multi-Intervention Outreach and Mentoring is quite a mouthful. I'm now going to hand over to Hannah from Brightside Mentoring. So I touched briefly on why we decided to pull mentoring out as a separate report. So this is Brightside's response to that evaluation report. So handing over to you now, Hannah. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah, and as Sarah said, I am Impact Manager at Brightside. I work on and oversee all of our mentoring program evaluations, along with our other strategic pieces of our impact work. Today, I will be talking about the findings from the mentoring evaluation and our thoughts on how they apply to our upcoming work. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'm just going to begin with an overview of who we are and our role in the project, and then I'll go on to discuss our reflections on the findings from the report and how they kind of like filter into what we'll be doing next. Who are we? So Brightside is a mentoring charity with the aim of supporting young people to make more confident and more informed decisions about their next steps. We do this predominantly through one-to-one text-based mentoring programs on our online moderated platform. We matched over 7,000 mentees in 2022, and we work with a very broad range of mentees. So from under 16 students who are still at school, all the way to prospective mature students. Each of our mentoring projects has its own aims and objectives. So that could include applying to higher education, learning more about apprenticeships, sector insight, and exploring post-16 pathways. On the programs that we evaluate, we measure and analyze many different types of data. So that includes our output or engagement data, intermediate outcome data. So that's our 6 theory of change outcomes that support that behavioral and capital decision making, and other project-specific outcomes relevant to that project. So that could be knowledge of post-16 options or roles within a particular sector, and things like that. We also report on quality or feedback data from both mentors and mentees, and track higher education entry and attainment for all relevant participants. So what do we do on this project? So we partnered with King's and Aston, both of whom we've been working with for a number of years, to deliver online mentoring on our moderated platform. We didn't evaluate this program. That was very much left to the research assistants at King's and Aston, but we did train the mentors on the project. We advised and facilitated platform use, so uploading mentees to our platform, kind of things of that nature. We enabled features on our platform, so our mentor matching tool, and we moderated messages and reported on engagements. So these are our reflections on the findings from the report. So the first is around structured mentoring. So Sarah did mention some of this kind of in her presentation, so just touching on that. We were particularly interested in the engagement findings from this report, specifically the finding that suggested mentees were more likely to respond than reach out to their mentor, which does follow, but it was really interesting to see in the report explicitly. Although our mentoring is delivered entirely by volunteers, we do believe it is crucial to remain active during a project to kind of maximize impact and engagement. So on the programs that we evaluate, we survey all of our volunteers at the end to gauge their experience on the program. And we do ask specifically about whether they felt their training prepared them for their role. In the last academic year, 90% of mentors agreed or strongly agreed with this, which is very positive, but does also reflect back the importance of kind of preparing mentors. As Sarah mentioned, it is quite a range. You get university students, a lot of mentors are mentoring for the first time. So yeah, it is really important to keep that consistent across. There's also a trend that we're seeing in our mentor qualitative data in our exit surveys that indicates that mentors really appreciate the structured nature of mentoring, specifically the inclusion of topics. So that could be like, for example, 1 week focusing on personal finance, the next week being about health and well-being options available at university, kind of things like that. And we do link these topics directly to our project-specific outcomes for each project. If anything, we're seeing requests for more structure and more topics, which we will be incorporating and integrating as we review our mentor training and guidance in the coming year. The report also recommended following up with mentors, and we have seen such success with certain automated engagement reminder features that we've actually made them compulsory in our programs, whereas our partners used to be able to opt in. So overall, really, it was just positive to see that in our own delivery and from our own mentors, there's evidence that reflects back the recommendations from the project. So now kind of on like the quantitative piece, this report has come out at a very interesting time for us as we're currently at the tail end of our theory of change outcomes review. This is a really radical change for us, and we're currently really rethinking holistically how we want to measure and benchmark what is good in terms of impact, engagement, and quality. This report, as Sarah mentioned, cautioned against exclusively using number of messages to indicate engagement level. And this is a conversation we're having all the time at Brightside. We have access to so much data, so many discrete engagement metrics because everything's delivered online. So that could be days active, days when messages were sent, word count, trends. So like, was it sent on a weekday or a weekend? Was it sent within school hours? And it's just really difficult to select one or really even a few indicators that would tell us how much or how well someone is engaging. We also undertook a huge review of our mentee qualitative responses to the question, did your mentors support you and how, in the last academic year? And we looked at over 600 of these responses and coded them. Broadly, we found that mentees fell into one of two camps. They either came to us with a fully formed idea of what they wanted to do, whether that was go to university or they wanted to take a career in STEM, something like that. Or they came to us wanting to explore their options without like a hard idea of what they wanted to do. Obviously, those two conversations will look really different. And even within those, they will look really different. But really all mentee conversations are going to look different because it's a highly personalized intervention. And likewise, really, a 15-year-old isn't going to interact with mentoring in the same way as an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old, especially in an online text-based context. So it's really challenging to measure engagement in a homogeneous way across our programs. So on to qualitative. With that in mind, we are considering how we can potentially integrate qualitative data, specifically conversations, into our benchmarking. I believe R was used on this project to conduct that sentiment analysis piece, but there are a number of software options available and low-tech solutions as well with Excel and things like that. So we're wondering, could we possibly integrate a number of question words or question marks, links to resources or the contents of those resources that are shared across, uploads of personal statements or applications, breakdown by topic, like what was done in this case, or coding by response or request. We're wondering, can we develop benchmarks for these kinds of indicators that could tell us more about the quality of the engagement and how well people are engaging on the programs? And given the breadth of our programs, we're really looking for a way to do this in a way that makes sense across all of our programs and isn't incredibly resource intensive. Wonderful. So what's next? As I said, we are finishing up our outcomes review, which you can read about in our impact report, which was published earlier this month. Please read it. We will continue to consider how to incorporate sentiment analysis and rethink benchmarking more generally. And one of the recommendations from this report was building more robust and useful resources for our partners to help them interpret their own data in a more meaningful way, especially when we are involved in the evaluation process. We will be publishing our journey and the outcome on our website and social media. So if you're interested in benchmarking or outcomes reviews more generally, please stay tuned for that. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Anna. So I have already mentioned that we have a separate publication for mentoring. So I would really recommend looking at that if you are interested to hear more about what was done and the findings. It was very much an exploratory evaluation, but we do have some good recommendations coming out from that, which Hannah has touched on around structured mentoring and using the data in the best way. But I'm now going to go on to our moat, which I feel like we've mentioned so many times now, so I'm glad we are finally here. So it is our mapping outcomes and activities tool. I cannot tell you how long it took to come up with a name with a good acronym. So I hope we've achieved that, or that it sticks in your head at least. But I'm going to talk through the moat and how we developed it, why we developed it, and how we recommend you use it, as well as showing you some sort of screenshots of what you'll be able to download. So why has the moat been developed? So we've noticed in this project that there's a bit of a lack of consistency in terms of how providers frame their activities, what they call their activities, what are the different sub-activities, if you like, coming off the main activities. So we really wanted to make this more consistent across the sector in terms of the type of typology of activities that is used in people's evaluation plans, in their theory of change, to aid that more consistent and more rigorous evaluation practice at provider level. So it means we can support the generation of more evidence, because at the moment, as we've alluded to, we are lacking evidence. So we need to try and support the sector in doing more consistent evaluation to build that evidence. But also a focus on how specific activities lead to particular outcomes. So this is obviously very relevant for multi-intervention outreach programs, because they are using different combinations of activities. So obviously overall, we're trying to increase participation in higher education, but what specific intermediate outcomes are going to lead us there, and which activities are linking to those specific outcomes. It's worth saying as well now that obviously this has been developed as part of this project, but that's not to say it can only be used as part of evaluation of multi-intervention outreach projects or programs. It can be used for individual activities as well. So it's kind of transcended beyond this project, but it was developed as part of this project. So what is the moat? What does it include? So what's included is our activity types and associated subtypes. So this will become clearer when I show you the screenshots in a moment, but we have our broad activity type. So that might be information, advice and guidance sessions. And then linked to that, you've got your associated subtypes. So this is breaking it down a bit more into finance, personal statements, course choice, provider choice. So just being a bit more specific there. And then beyond that, we've also got our different outcomes. And these are grouped based on how quickly you might expect to achieve those outcomes. So in the short term, in the intermediate term, or in the long term, but also attitudinal and behavioural outcomes. And then finally, what we've done is a mapping. So a mapping of which activity subtypes link to the most relevant outcomes. So this is based on our experience from this project in particular, so working with our 3 project partners, but also in conjunction with the sector. So we did hold workshops with different sector stakeholders to discuss this a bit more, and also from our own experience on different projects outside of this project as well. So I'm now going to show some screenshots just to see what you can look out for in downloading this. So what is available to download? The practical resource to be able to download is an Excel spreadsheet, which I've screenshotted here, and it is in separate tabs. So our first tab is focused on our types and subtypes of activity. So hopefully you can see clearly along the top, we have our types. So these are our broad subject types, which might include mentoring, summer schools. Obviously not all of them are on here, it has been cut off a bit, but information and advice and guidance, as I mentioned, subject insights, and then underneath we're split into the more granular subtypes. So this is designed to be used based on your own programs. So for some of you, you might not incorporate all of these activities in your program, or you might just want to focus on one activity. So it's really for you to use in an autonomous way, depending on your own programs. And also, you obviously don't need to choose one subtype per type. So you don't just have to choose finance, for example, for information, advice and guidance sessions. You can choose multi subtypes, basically, based on what you're delivering. So it's really about setting out the different types and subtypes so that we're consistent, but obviously still giving providers and evaluators autonomy to choose the ones that are relevant to them. I wanted to take a little interlude here, just to touch on skills and attainment raising in particular. So at the moment, our moat has a placeholder for this, which I've circled there. So we do not currently include mapping for skills and attainment raising. And that's purely because we've pulled this out to focus on it separately. So we're currently working with the OFS as well as the 3 national trackers to do a more complex mapping or enhanced mapping, particularly focused on skills and attainment, because we know this is really a primary focus in the sector at the moment. We know it's a priority. So we are pulling that out, and it will be integrated into our evaluation guidance very soon. So we have not by no means forgotten about it. We know how important it is. So we have placeholders in there for now, and it will be integrated once we've sort of conducted our working with the OFS and the 3 national trackers. So the next tab on our moat is our outcome bins. So as I mentioned in a previous slide, we have split these into not only behavioural and non-behavioural, but also short-term, intermediate term, and long-term. So the temporal element is really important, because some outcomes you're unlikely to achieve just by one session. So for example, if you're holding an IAG session, you would probably expect, if the student is engaged, if they're listening, you would expect their knowledge to increase after the session. So that's something you could measure in the short term. However, things like sense of belonging, motivation, confidence, social self-efficacy, these are things that are likely not going to be developed until they've attended perhaps a few activities. So it's more of a cumulative outcome, so which is why they're placed more in the intermediate outcomes. And then our long-term outcomes are more overarching, so our increased enrolment in HE, application to HE. So that's not to say that different outcomes won't be in different bins. So for example, you can see that motivation is in intermediate as well as long-term. So it might transcend different bins, but it's more to just point out when you should really expect changes in your outcomes and what's realistic and what's feasible based on what you're delivering. It's also worth flagging that we know this isn't going to encompass every possible outcome, and it's not worthwhile us doing that really. If we're trying to build consistency in the sector and build the evidence in the sector in terms of what is measured, we needed to confine the list to some extent so that there wasn't every possible outcome. But it's worth saying this is a starting point. This is to enable consistency, but again, we're really advocating for provider and evaluator autonomy. You know your programs, you know what outcomes you're addressing. So it's not to say to scrap any outcomes that aren't included here. We just think these are the core ones and will allow greater consistency to allow us to generate that evidence. And then final tab is around mapping. So what you can see on the left here is our activity type. So our broad activity types. Next to that is our subtypes. And then this is where we've done the mapping. So to link our activities to the most relevant outcomes. So as I've mentioned, this is based on our experience on this project in particular, but also different projects that we've worked on over the years. And in some cases, it's evidence-based. So as part of our survey validation work, which you might be familiar with, where we've developed what we're calling a WP questionnaire to address some key outcomes. So an evidence review was conducted as part of that project. So in some cases, this mapping is evidence-based as well as based on experience. So this again is a starting point for providers to complete their evaluation plans and their theory of change using our mapping. And again, I really like to stress that we want to advocate for provider and evaluator autonomy. So you know your programs, you know what activities you think are most linked to your outcomes. So this is more for a starting point. It's more to interrogate the links between activities and outcomes. But based on our knowledge, based on our experience, and based on some of the evidence, we believe this mapping makes sense in terms of which activities are likely to affect which outcomes. So that is a little whistle-stop tour of the moat. So look out for that Excel spreadsheet that you will be able to download. It's also worth saying that there is individual guidance within the spreadsheet as well. So you don't need to remember exactly what I'm saying now. But we are encouraging everyone to use the moat to help develop a theory of change for your outreach programs or even on individual activities. So in that sense, we'd recommend looking at our evaluation guidance resources on our website, where we have our core theory of change and our enhanced theory of change and guidance and examples of how to use both. So we recommend using the moat to complete that theory of change with the relevant activities and outcomes for your programs. But if you do already have a theory of change, again, it's just using the moat to review it and look at the existing links. Do they align with how we've done the mapping on the moat, and just allowing you to be a bit more reflective and interrogate those causal links between an activity and an outcome. So how do you think that activity is leading to that outcome, and what assumptions need to be met for that to happen? Okay, so I'm now going to hand over to Anna from the Higher Education Access Tracker, so from HEAT. And she's going to talk a little bit more about how HEAT are aligning with TASO's moat and how the moat will be integrated in. So I'll hand over to you now, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. So yes, as Sarah said, I'm going to be talking about our plans to integrate TASO's moat into the HEAT system. So it's currently our plan to build some logic into our evaluation plans tool. This logic would recommend or suggest the most appropriate outcomes based on the activity that you tell the system you're evaluating. It's important to say that at this point, these are plans, and any development is still to be agreed by the heat membership, but I think that everyone will agree that these changes will be beneficial to the sector and all heat users. So first slide, please, Sarah, thank you. First, I wanted to give a bit of background on the evaluation plans tool on heat. It's a tool built into the system to help users plan the evaluation for an activity or programme, and those plans are then tied to the activity record, which are already being recorded on heat. And this planning of evaluation is something that the OFS are now asking to see much more of, and the evaluation plans tool is able to provide a system to do a lot of that reporting. So it was first released to our live database in 2021, but we have made some changes recently to adapt the tool in order to help members. So particularly in relation to these three areas that I've listed. Firstly, to respond to the latest requirements from the OFS in relation to access and participation plans. However, the changes that we've made are useful for all providers when planning their evaluation, so not just those with APPs, but our templates and format does align with the OFS's. We've also changed our theory of change template so that it matches TASO's and also the OFS's intervention strategy template. And this work has really paved the way for these latest changes that we're now planning, so incorporating the moat, because we're all using the same templates now. And finally there, we've also listened to our members who have been using the tool and responded to their feedback too. So we now plan to continue to work with TASO to ensure that our evaluation plans tool aligns with their guidance more generally, and this includes incorporating the moat, which I'm going to show you next. But before I do that, I just want to explain why I think all heat members should be using the evaluation plans tool on heat. So first, the requirements from the OFS. I've already mentioned that the OFS are asking for much more in the way of evaluation planning. So they now want providers to submit evaluation plans for intervention strategies, including a theory of change linked to outcomes, details on how each outcome will be monitored and evaluated, details of methodologies, and all of that linked to the activities that underpin the intervention strategy. And all of that can be achieved using the reporting from the evaluation plans tool, which is already linked to the activity records you're recording on heat. And the second, it's that it makes sense to have all your data in one place on heat. So to store your evaluation plans alongside your data on delivery that you're already recording on heat. And I think my next slide shows why that's so important. So here you can see the 4 stages required for successful evaluation. We have planning your evaluation, targeting appropriate schools and colleges, recording and monitoring delivery data, and then reporting outcomes. And then on the right, you can see the tools and features within heat that can be used for each stage, listed here as 1.1 to 4.3, with the evaluation plans tool being the first in the list. So heat members will be familiar with all or some of those, but if you'd like to find out more information on each item there, you can find guidance, links to guidance on our website. So if you choose the Why Join Heat section in the menu on the left, then extend the Delivery and Developing APP section and scroll down, you'll see this diagram here with all the links. Oh, sorry, not quite finished with that one, thank you. The arrows on the right there show how all these stages are linked, so that you need to refer back to evaluation plans as your data on delivery becomes available. So we already use heat extensively across the sector for stages 2 to 4. And by having your plans on the same system, you can more easily integrate data from each of these stages. So on heat, it's the activity record that ties much of this together. So that field ties your plans with your data for monitoring and evaluation. And at heat, we have the monitoring dashboard, which integrates this for you and allows you to see which plans are linked to which activities and also links your activities with the monitoring and evaluation data that you've either already collected or is in the pipeline for that activity. Next slide, please. Right, so currently the evaluation plans tool asks you to record a theory of change on a tab that looks like this one in the screenshot here. And then you are asked to populate 10 areas that I've listed on the right, most of which are free text boxes. So I know from having worked on evaluation plans with the UniConnect partnership in Kent and Medway that the outcomes and the rationale and assumptions sections take a lot of time and thinking to populate properly. So to do it properly, you need to work through an enhanced theory of change. And we did that in our recent evaluation plans webinar for a Year 7 literacy attainment raising intervention that is run by the Kent and Medway UniConnect partnership. So please do watch that webinar recording if you can. It's in our video library. We spent a lot of time deciding on the right outcomes to measure and also justifying why those outcomes are appropriate in the rationale and assumption section. And that was all very necessary, but I do think it's likely that at the moment we're all spending a lot of time working separately to develop similar theories of change and reading similar evidence, but it would make much more sense and be much more efficient if we were to collaborate on that rather than working in silos. So this is where Tezos Mote comes in. It's an excellent resource to support this time-consuming work and reduce the duplication of effort and also build capacity across the sector. So my next slide shows how we plan to integrate Tezos Mote into the evaluation plans on HEAT. First, we will introduce logic where the system suggests the outcomes based on the activity type you've selected. So you can see from this diagram on the left how this might work. For example, if you select mentoring, the system will then ask you to choose from a subtype list linked to mentoring, which Sarah presented. And then from that selection, the system will suggest the most relevant outcomes. So in this example, we have mentoring, the subtype being peer mentoring, and then the outcome being, that we've selected is motivation. And we think that this will really help users to select the appropriate outcomes according to the evidence based on Tezos Mote, but not be restrictive in terms of your creativity, because you can still add your own outcomes as free text boxes like you can at the moment using the evaluation plans tool. So as part of this development, we will also start recording sector-wide data on this more detailed activity subtype, which has been mapped to HEAT's main activity types. And this will improve the consistency and detail in all HEAT members' activity data recording. And finally, you'll also be able to much more easily populate the rationale and assumption sections of your theory of change, because Tezos work will provide that evidence from the literature. And my final slide now talks about next steps. So first, as I mentioned, we need to get approval from the HEAT research group for this work. After that, we need to identify funding, which is likely to be through a joint bid between Tezo and HEAT. That's to be confirmed. We will then do the necessary development on the HEAT system. After that, the membership will be able to start collecting consistent data based on these new two fields, so the subtype and the outcomes. And these fields will be included in HEAT's member level dashboards, such as our tracking dashboards, for you all to use in your local evaluations. And the final point on the slide is to say that from this consistent sector-wide data, it will also be possible to generate further evidence to inform Tezos Mote. Thank you for listening. That's the end.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. And just to say as well, it's great to be working on HEAT on this, but we are also working with the other national trackers, so Aim Higher and MREP, and we really encourage our resources to be integrated where possible, so to enable that consistency and build the evidence across the sector, as Anna says. Before we move on to the Q&A, I'm just going to briefly just focus on the key takeaways from today's session and from our reports. So I outlined earlier that we have a number of reports, so I do really encourage you to have a look on our website and explore those reports and those individual reports which take more of your interest, whether that be the local evaluation reports or the mentoring report. But in particular to the moat, first of all, we'd really recommend that you familiarize yourself with the moat visual overview. So this isn't something that I haven't showed yet. So it looks a bit like this. I'm not going to go through each of the boxes, and I can appreciate from your angle on the screen now, it probably looks very small and a little scary, but it's more just to look out for those colors and the visual representation, because that's something on our website that you can download as well. And it just provides a visual overview of the activity types, subtypes, and the different outcomes, as well as a separate definitions page. But for the more practical use of the moat, we'd really recommend downloading the spreadsheet to access those tabs that I showed you earlier. The definitions for the outcomes is included in that spreadsheet as well. And as I mentioned, there is further guidance in the downloadable spreadsheet. So it will show you how we'd expect you to use the different tabs and why we've settled on different activities and outcomes. And then use the moat to develop a theory of change. So in our evaluation guidance resources, we have, as I said, either a core theory of change or an enhanced theory of change, depending where you are on your evaluation journey. And there's examples from our attainment raising work in particular, where those core and enhanced theories of changes have been populated, and guidance on how to use them. So we recommend using the moat to build your theory of change by selecting the activities and the outcomes relevant to your programs, and also looking at that mapping to help build the causal pathways, so how one activity leads to an outcome and eventually your long-term goal. But as I've said as well, if you do already have a theory of change developed, it's again just looking at the moat, seeing how well the moat aligns with your theory of change, and just allowing you to be a bit more reflective and consistent in how you're looking at outcomes. And once that's been developed, we then recommend using TASO's further resources online to think about how you're going to measure those outcomes. So how you know your programs are working or having the desired effect. So there's 2 resources that we're signposting to you to now, and these will be signposted on the moat section of our website. But we have a common outcome measures framework, which will be really useful in how to measure different aspects. But also what we're calling at the moment our WP questionnaire, or our widening participation questionnaire. So this has been generated from the survey validation work. So there's a set of partially validated scales, so they're being validated currently in the sector, that you can access for how to measure intermediate outcomes such as sense of belonging. So those are our key takeaways, but I'm now going to hand back over to Helen to chair for the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that, and to all our presenters today for those excellent presentations. I can see there are a fair few questions coming through, but a starter one. We had a question on theories of change. So when developing a theory of change for a multi-intervention program, is it better to develop multiple theories of change with similar outcomes and impact, or one theory of change that's all integrated? Sarah, yes.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and actually something that came up a lot, especially in this project when we were trying to map the different programs that were happening and the different activities. I don't think there's any right way. I would say that our enhanced theory of change template, which you may well be familiar with, but I would encourage you to go and look at on the website. It allows you to do more of a breakdown of the activities which make up your broader multi-intervention outreach program, and there's more space to sort of interrogate individual activities and the pathways which link to specific outcomes. So in that case, I think it's really useful to look at that as a broader picture. But again, depending on where you are in your evaluation journey, if you want to focus specifically on one activity and one outcome and how you're measuring that, and if that individual activity is having the desired effect, then it would make sense to narrow down on that in a theory of change as well. So it depends what specific area you want to focus on, which I appreciate is quite a general answer, but there's no right or wrong specifically there.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. We had a point about the picking up on the earlier presentations about the fact that there's no evidence of any difference in self-reported applications to highly selective applications for both KCL and the Aston programs. So the question was, does this suggest that applicants to the programs had an existing predisposition to progress to these high tariff institutions? And if so, what does this tell us about how we target young people? So really, that just to reiterate that this is interim data, and we need to wait for the final outcome data from HESA before drawing certain conclusions, as Sarah's mentioned a couple of times. But we do know that it's highly likely that applicants to these programs are already highly motivated and already considering higher education as a future option. But interestingly, internal institutional data held by Aston indicates that most of the treatment group students who did not hold an acceptance to study had deferred their application for a year or intend to reapply for the next academic year. So maybe these programs play an important role in aiding informed decision making. We've had some questions around involving a control group in evaluation. So I think these are for Yassi. Were the intermediate outcomes collected for both treatment and control? And were there any difficulties with this? For example, how did you motivate the control group to complete outcome measures? Was there any attrition? That one's for Yassi.
Yeah, this is something that was a concern from the beginning, that we knew that we would struggle to incentivize control group students to continue to engage with us. So we did target them with incentives, but obviously there was a smaller group of responses from the control group than from the treatment group, because we're able to follow up with treatment group students through actual events.
And staying with you, Yassi, when looking at rates of application and enrolment into selective HEs, which was self-reported, was the rate of response? What was the rate of response when you asked students to report their progression?
The rate of response when asking students to report their progression, as
Yes.
in the number of students who responded to the survey. It was around 10% of students.
Around 10%, thank you. We've also had some questions around the validation of outcome measures, so I'll combine these questions. The intermediate outcome measures for the K+ and RCT weren't validated. Does the TASO team or Yassi have any suggestions for what we could use to better measure intermediate outcomes? Yassi or Sarah?
Yeah, I was going to say, you go, Yassi, and I can come in.
So obviously, when we kind of started the process, there were no validated scales, but throughout the time, from the beginning of the study, TASO have developed the WP questionnaire. So that would be, now that there is a validated measure that can be used for those intermediate outcomes.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thanks, Yassi. So just, building on that a bit. So for example, you measured sense of belonging. So this was something where we didn't have a validated scale. So it was about building scales from existing scales, but them not perhaps quite working particularly for that group of students or in the HE sector. So sense of belonging is something that we focused on in the WP questionnaire, and that's both pre-entry sense of belonging, so for younger students, but also post-entry sense of belonging for students that are already in HE. So as I mentioned earlier, they're partially validated at the moment. So we're currently fully validating in the sector to get that sort of real world data from the HE sector.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Another outcomes related question: are the outcomes included in local evaluations the only outcomes that can be measured when evaluating multi-intervention outreach programmes?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was going to say, Yassi, you might be able to speak to any, I suppose, any developments for K+, what you used in this evaluation, and have you changed, what outcomes you're measuring at the moment?
I don't think there's been any key changes at this stage in terms of the outcomes that are being measured. I think one of the things that this evaluation prompted was thinking maybe to be sort of a bit more refined, particularly about the intermediate outcomes. So just being a bit more selective about what we're sort of focusing on measuring.
Thank you, Yassi. We've had, and as Sarah did touch on this as part of her presentation, but we've had a fair few questions around whether we're working with the other national trackers to ensure consistency across the sector. So the answer to that is yes, that we are working with all 3 national trackers to encourage integration of the moat. And of course, there are differences in how national trackers label and code activities and outcomes. And it's hoped that with time we'll be able to use the moat to offer consistency across trackers, which will make the mechanics of logging activities and outcomes more straightforward for the sector. We've had some questions coming through as well around RCTs. An RCT question: how did you control for the other WP activities the control group may be taking part in? So throw that to Yassi.
Yeah, this is a really important question. It's something that currently there isn't a way that we can do this kind of from collecting administrative data. So when sending out the survey to students to collect intermediate outcomes, we also included questions where we asked them to self-report if they'd participated in any other programs as an attempt to use that potentially in some of the analysis to control for that. But obviously, because of the low response rate, it means that it's only a very small group of the sample provided that data. So it's definitely something that kind of is flagged up as an area that maybe there could be some work done.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to come in on that. It's a problem we've also had for our summer schools evaluation as well. So a lot of WP students are likely going to outreach programs at a range of different universities or have applied to a range of different summer schools. So yeah, as Yassi said, it is really difficult to control for. Essentially, we can't control whether they're going elsewhere. What we're also doing in terms of tracking, though, is also using the heat tracker. So particularly for our summer schools project is looking at using the higher education access tracker to see what other outreach activities students are taking part in. So that gives us some idea as well as the self-report.
Thank you, Sarah. Another kind of our RCT related question: rather than large-scale RCTs that have single case experimental single case experimental designs been considered to better understand intermediate and individual outcomes? Is that what? Would you like to answer that, Sarah?
Sorry, I was thinking that was going to Yassi. Could you repeat the question, please?
I can throw it over to Sarah or Yassi. Rather than large-scale RCTs, have single experimental designs been considered to better understand intermediate and individual outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, in a word, yes, definitely. I think, as I alluded to at the start, we are really lacking this causal evidence in the sector. So we have a lot of evidence that focuses on intermediate outcomes, that focuses on an association between attendance, but we are lacking that causal evidence. So that's the reason we did focus on running a randomized control trial, because that's the best way to develop that causal evidence. But that's not to say that that's the only aspect of the project. Obviously, as part of the project as well, which Yassi and Helen might be able to go into a little bit more, we did do some implementation and process evaluation. So this involved more qualitative interviews with students as well, to get a better understanding of what outcomes their participation might have led to, as well as focusing on these validated scales to ensure that we're measuring these intermediate outcomes effectively. And essentially, that's what we want to do with the moats. We want to understand what specific activities and elements are leading to which outcomes. So it's important that we do break that down as much as possible, rather than just looking at large scale and looking at enrolment in HE ultimately.
Thank you, Sarah. And would you like to add to what Sarah's been saying? Yassi?
I think the only thing I would add is that it could potentially be useful in the context of a multi-intervention program, where you might want to kind of be a bit more targeted and focused on specific aspects or elements within that.
Thank you, Yassi. A question about the moat. So how will the database underpinning moat be developed going forwards? There are a very broad range of outreach contexts and interventions. It must be representative if it's to be meaningful across the field. I'm throwing that one to you again, Sarah.
Yes, of course. No, I completely understand that it needs to be representative. I mean, that's why we did try and work with as many stakeholders as possible to understand what the key activities are. We know that programs vary quite a lot. For example, some programs include cultural activities or really career-focused activities, so others don't. So it's really trying to incorporate that, as well as your more typical summer schools or IAG sessions. So we've really tried to use a breadth of activities. But equally, as I mentioned sort of in my presentation, we couldn't include everything. I think during our workshops with the sector, it was difficult at times, because we'd end up with the longest list you could possibly imagine. But if we want to generate more evidence in this space, we need people to use the terms consistently and the activity types consistently, and use the outcomes consistently and measure outcomes consistently as well, so that we can build up that evidence base. But yeah, that's not to say that we don't expect people to still be able to enter their own outcomes or their own activities if they feel that it doesn't quite fit. And obviously, we're only launching this today, so we really want to have an ongoing conversation with the sector on how we use this going forward, and any changes we can make to make it more useful. But yeah, this is just the start.
Great, thank you, Sarah. A question for Anna. The OFS are releasing the Reg 6 guidance today. When will the theory of change be updated to reflect any changes, which will be useful for Wave 1 APP submissions? Many teams are working on their talks now.
Right, I've seen the Reg 6 guidance, and I've seen the new theory of change that the OFS are going to be using, and I don't think it's sufficiently different to warrant us to change the evaluation plans tool theory of change. So what they've done is taken away impacts. They've only taken away, really, so they haven't added anything. So I don't think we're missing any fields in our current theory of change. Taken away impacts. They've still got outcomes, which is already in there. They've combined objectives and targets, which are two separate fields on our tool, but it doesn't make any difference. So I don't think it does need to be updated. It doesn't need to be changed. However, if you don't agree with me, please do let me know, because it's not actually that difficult to make changes, and we have some changes in the pipeline for the evaluation plans tool. So it's all possible. So if you think I'm wrong there, please do email me and say what the changes that you think would work for you.
Thank you, Anna. And just staying with you for the moment, within HEAT's evaluation plan tool, do you recommend having one evaluation plan per project or one per project cycle? So if a project is 18 months long and the person attaches all the cycles activity to it, or multiple cycle activity to one evaluation plan?
I think that's a similar question to the question that Sarah answered in the beginning about whether you do a theory of change, a large one or a small one. And I think it just depends at what level it makes sense for you to evaluate at. It is possible to do it at either level. So the tool can be used because you can attach multiple activities to one plan, or you can also attach multiple plans to one activity. So I think it will depend on how you're already using HEAT operationally and what level you record activities. We did in our APP webinar that we did earlier in the year, we did suggest doing evaluation plans at 2 different levels. So you do it at intervention strategy level, and at that level you would use the reporting from the evaluation plans tool to submit to the OFS in their intervention strategy template, because the reporting from the tool can be easily pasted into their template. So you'd have to do it at that level, the intervention strategy level, which would be a high up level, but you'd also need to do it at the lower down program level, because it's critical that you get the theories of change right at the lower down program level, because quite often, excuse me, the outcomes will be slightly different and the timeline for the outcomes will be different. You might be working with slightly different cohorts of students, and it's critical that you get the theories of change right and you do the evaluation at that level in order to make sense of what you're delivering. So it probably seems like quite a lot of work, quite results intensive, but I think I would recommend that you do it at both levels.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Another moat related question. Will TASO be showing definitions for all the possible subtype activities that come under the overarching moat types? Sarah.
That's a really good point, actually. At the moment, we've only got definitions for more of the intermediate outcomes. So things like sense of belonging, social self-efficacy. So things where it needs to be more clearly defined. But we don't actually have definitions included at the moment for the activity subtype. So if people think that will be helpful to be really clear what we mean by these activity subtypes, then that's definitely something we can add in.
I think we've had a question again, sort of a project and RCT related, about whether we'll be running another RCT sort of on multi-intervention outreach and mentoring programs post-COVID. I'm not sure that's the question that we can answer right now, but it's certainly something that it would be interested in doing. Obviously, the same with our summer schools program and our summer schools RCT. The first project that we ran was the summer school was completely online. We were in the depths of COVID, and which seems like such a long time ago, but in the depths of COVID and lockdowns and restrictions. And the second RCT that we've run, which we've just completed, and we'll be sharing findings soon. As of course, this was a very different offer. It was face-to-face this time, and some interesting findings coming out from that project. So I think it's definitely something that we're aware of, that there will be differences in findings depending on whether it was run sort of online and during something like a pandemic, and when things are almost going back to normal. For example, with the context certainly had a big impact on mentoring, for example. Of course, a lot of that was online rather than being in face-to-face. providers had to very quickly come up with strategies and ways of managing that process. So sometimes that was perhaps doing an online sort of a group session rather than that one-to-one session. So yes, that's certainly something we're considering, and something we're certainly aware of. Is it possible to access the WP questionnaire? If we're, yeah, Sarah.
Yes, in a word, definitely. It's yeah, it's in our evaluation guidance resources on our website, so it is available to download. The questionnaire is a spreadsheet, as well as the guidance documents and the background evidence review. So yes, do definitely have a look on our website for that, but give us an email if you're struggling to find it at all, and we can send it through to you.
Okay, I think unless there are any more questions, I think we've managed anything that when we come back to have a look at when we look through the chat, anything that we haven't answered, we will certainly be able to we'll try and update people. Similarly, if you have any questions, or you suddenly think of something that you'd really like to know once you've signed off, then please do drop us a line and get in touch with us. So I can see that's popped up. It just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for joining us. I was going to say that a poll will be popping up, but I can see that's already popped up, that we'd like to know how likely you will be to use the moat, having heard the more about it today. And also to say that we will be sharing a survey with you around the event. So that'll be appearing in your inboxes very shortly after the event has finished. It'd be great if you could respond to those and let us know your thoughts. Okay, thank you very much. So thank you to all our panelists, to Yassi, to Sarah, to Hannah, and to Anna. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you to everyone for joining us and for your questions. Okay, thank you everyone.